Hello everybody and welcome to Every Movie Ever, the show where we are still trying to review every movie ever made. More than 30 episodes in now, still haven't gotten there. Maybe today we'll do it. And we'll start today by reviewing The Jazz Singer. Now, a lot of you might know The Jazz Singer as the very first, or purported to be the very first, talkie movie, the very first movie with sound, starring Al Jolson. We are not going to talk about that movie, though. Instead, we're going to talk about the 1980 remake starring Neil Diamond. And what a lousy movie this is, folks. Neil Diamond stars as basically Neil Diamond. We're supposed to believe that he is a cantor, so a guy that sings at the synagogue, a Jewish guy in New York, who goes out to LA to strike it rich, and man, LA falls in love with that easy listening, crowd-pleasing Neil Diamond music. But that does require there to be a split between Neil and his father, played by Laurence Olivier, who is playing a borderline offensive older Jewish man, and Lucy Arnaz, daughter of Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz, plays Neil's love interest in California, whom, that's right, Neil leaves his New York wife for, in a scene that is understated at best. Pretty much Neil's in California, the wife shows up and she's like, I don't think I like all this famousness. And that's it, they're divorced. And then as soon as Lucy Arnaz gets pregnant, Neil Diamond skedaddles out of there and spends, seriously, a year singing at a truck stop, only to then go back home and reunite with Lucy, and everything is hunky-dory. Ton of Neil Diamond songs in this. That song America is in this, a bunch of others. This is a really lousy movie. Neil is completely unlikable through the whole thing. It's difficult to believe that he would have agreed to do this movie with this script. I assume his ego got in the way. I don't know. It's a real tough watch because it's both a tough watch because he's so sleazy and sort of entertaining from a in what world could this have ever happened sort of a movie. So it's just watchable enough that I am going to give it 2 stars. Now, if you're like me, and I know I am, you've seen these Bratz dolls at your local department store. They're the ones where they have the real super skinny body, but then the great big heads with the big eyes, and they're fashion dolls like Barbie, but with attitude. Well, they decided to make a movie about the Bratz, and fortunately for all of us, it is live action, so you don't have to look into those soulless giant eyes for very long. Or at all, I suppose. This is a standard kind of high school girl clique kind of a movie about a group of 4 friends, the eponymous Bratz, who, when they start going to school, they're all really friends, but one of them's a cheerleader, and one of them's a smarty, and one of them's a something else. And the high school clique systems mean they can no longer be friends. So then we flash forward 3 years to see them reunite as friends again. Yeah, it's real dumb. The plot doesn't make a lot of sense. That time gap is really bizarre. It's all very cliche, but there are some fun subversive moments in it. There's a villain named Meredith who's, you know, a popular girl. She's kind of fun. She sings a song at one point called It's All About Me, which is so on the nose that it's sort of hilarious. There's also weird things like how the high school they go to is named after a famous suffragette who carried an axe. So like all the teams are like the Hatchet Men or something like that. Also at one point they're listing all the cliques, the nerds, the preppies, the jocks. And one of them is the dinosaur clique, which is a bunch of kids that like to pretend to be dinosaurs. So those subversive moments are kind of fun and almost make the movie worth watching, but they never quite overcome the banality of the rest of the movie, which is why I'm giving Bratz 2 stars. So one of the joys of doing this show for me is getting to finally watch movies that I have always been curious about but never bothered to watch, and one of those movies is definitely Penelope. Penelope, if you're not familiar with it, is a sort of, you know, early 2000s fairy tale-ish kind of a movie, although it's set in modern day. about a young girl who is born with a pig nose and has to find true love. That girl is played by Christina Ricci, who is fairly charming in this. You might remember Christina Ricci. She played, when I was growing up, she was Wednesday Addams in the Addams Family movies. And then she sort of hung around for a while, did a few more roles. This is an acceptable role to me. She's pretty charming in this. Again, the story is that her family years ago were dicks to some sort of a witch or something, and so the witch laid on a curse that eventually a kid was going to get born with a pig nose. That's Christina Ricci, and if she can find true love, then she won't have a pig nose anymore, and the movie is all about learning to love somebody for who they are inside and ignoring the fact that they have a pig nose. Christina Ricci's fairly charming in this. Like I said, this is at least before she started taking, let's call them sexier roles, like in Sleepy Hollow, more objectified roles, which, given that this is an actress that we kind of watched grow up, those roles are really kind of troubling. James McAvoy plays the scamp who starts out trying to love Christina Ricci for the wrong reasons, only to fall in love with her for real. And then the real surprise of the movie is Christina Ricci's eventual BFF is played by Reese Witherspoon. So if you can imagine a world and a reality wherein Reese Witherspoon is second banana to Christina Ricci, that's the movie we have here. Again, nothing against Christina Ricci, it's just in this early Reese Witherspoon role, you can already see which of these two is going to be a big star and which, you know, really isn't. Again, a fairly charming movie, not the greatest thing I have ever seen in my life, but an enjoyable diversion nonetheless. 3 stars. Now over at the Houston house, we're all big fans of Katherine Heigl movies. Katherine Heigl, you know, started out, I don't know about I guess I can't say started out, since we all know about her early role in a movie I reviewed a few episodes back, which was My Father the Hero. Is that what that thing was called? Gerard Depardieu movie. In any event, she kind of comes to prominence in Grey's Anatomy, then turns out to be a huge monster, I guess, behind the scenes, allegedly. And now she makes a bunch of not great movies that are typically pretty fun to watch. Jenny's Wedding is the one I want to talk to you about today. This is a movie wherein Katherine Heigl comes out to her family as gay and says she's going to be marrying Alexis Bledel from Gilmore Girls, although Alexis is very barely in this movie. And the entire 90 minutes is a movie about Katherine Heigl's family grappling and coming to grips with the idea that their daughter is gay, while Katherine Heigl grapples and comes to grips with her parents being terrible. Tom Wilkinson is the dad who simply cannot stomach the revelation and gets into really weird, shouty fights with Katherine Heigl inside of like churches and things in front of big groups. Grace Gummer, the typically pretty charming daughter of Meryl Streep, is in this movie as Katherine Heigl's sister, who I think thanks to Heigl's revelation comes to realize that her own marriage is terrible and ends up, I think, divorcing her husband on the basis that there's a brown patch in their yard. It's very bizarre. This is a really weird and retrograde movie that seems like a movie that would have come out in the early 2000s and been, a semi-serious comedy about, what was then a very, I think, real issue of families coming to grips with things in a changing time, but which in 2000, this is a movie that only came out in like 2015, feels very old-fashioned and weird. It's also just plain kind of a bad movie. Most of the movie is scenes with just 2 people in them. So it's like Katherine Heigl and her mother having a scene together, or the mother and the mother's friend having a scene together, or Katherine Heigl and Tom Wilkinson having a scene together, or Grace Gummer and her husband having a scene together. So it's these, interminable 2-person dialogue scenes. It's a real rough movie. 1.5 stars. La La Land was the big almost Oscar winner from last year. It's Emma Stone and Ryan Gosling in a modern movie musical, soft shoeing and singing their way around Los Angeles. There are a couple of would-be, wannabe actors and movie makers just trying to get through that rat race in LA. This is a movie that a lot of people, hipsters, liked quite a bit. It was on a lot of top 10 lists. Like it was nominated for Best Picture, and will ultimately have the asterisk and footnote of having been wrongly announced as the Best Picture winner at the Oscars that year, when the real winner was Moonlight. So it's a movie that it took me a while to get around to seeing, and if I had to describe La La Land in one word, that one word would be obnoxious. I did not care for this movie whatsoever. I found the singing and the dancing subpar, even though I really, really like Emma Stone and am, you know, okay with Ryan Gosling. But this movie is a complete falls flat to me. It is the sort of movie that seems like it's made just for people in LA and that the filmmakers all feel very, very clever about themselves about, but it did not work for me. 2 stars. Let's talk about a movie called The Great Gilly Hopkins. This is a movie about a young foster girl who gets taken into a foster house by Kathy Bates and has a lot of trouble fitting in. We get the impression that Gilly has always had trouble fitting in, but once she gets to Kathy Bates' house, it makes friends with Kathy Bates, makes friends with her blind neighbor, and makes friends with the other young boy who's living there, who's a young man who's on the spectrum, and she helps him get out of his shell. Gilly herself starts to open up her heart and starts to find a home. Glenn Close shows up late into the movie as Gilly's biological grandmother who wants to adopt Gilly, and then even later in the movie we meet Gilly's actual mom, who is played by Julia Stiles in a real, first off, real happy to see Julia Stiles again. That's an actress who I feel like has kind of unfairly ended up in movie jail and isn't getting the amount of work she should anymore. Great to see her again. A little sad to see her in a real two-dimensional role as a mom who does not care about her kid. This whole movie is, it's okay, but I think it falls flat because of a lot of cliches and a lot of wooden and cardboard characterization and acting. Still, it's a nice enough story, a good movie I think probably for the whole family. Some nice performances, some nice lessons. 2.5 stars. Another movie that we can add to the, it's about time I got around to watching this movie I've been curious about all my life, is Down with Love. This is the movie where Ewan McGregor, who, you know, I always enjoy seeing Ewan McGregor in a movie. I think he's a charming actor who does not get, he does get a lot of work, he doesn't get a lot of good work. He's a better actor than the material he usually ends up with. This is kind of no exception, as Ewan McGregor plays a schmoozy 60s man's man author who who goes up against Renee Zellweger, who is herself a new author, a feminist author out on the scene, and Ewan launches a really bizarre plan to make her fall in love with him to prove that women do need men, but then at the end there's a bizarre twist where it turns out that Renee was using him all along, and I don't really know what the heck was going on in this movie. It's really complicated. David Hyde Pierce is Ewan McGregor's friend. The always terrific Sarah Paulson is Renee Zellweger's friend. The whole thing has a terrific 60s production design. It was directed by Peyton Reed, who started to come to prominence in recent years for directing the Ant-Man movies. And he does a good job directing this movie. It looks great and it's staged wonderfully, and they capture pretty well the look of that sort of 60s farce. Tony Randall also appears in a fairly welcome, something between an actual role and a cameo, as a major publisher in the movie. Unfortunately, the movie is a little confusing and never quite works on its own terms, which is why I'm giving it 2 stars. Oh gosh, my glasses fell off again. You know, it's because when you take your glasses on and off a lot, you put a lot of wear on the arms. What you need is like a little handle right here so that the pressure can be put on the bridge of the nose like it was always meant to be. Yes, of course I am getting ready to review The Jerk, the classic Steve Martin comedy of the 1970s, directed by the amazing Carl Reiner. It's the rags to riches story of Maven Johnson, played by Steve Martin, who was born a poor black child and ends up making $1 million as the inventor of the OptiGrab, a little handle that goes in the middle of your glasses that unfortunately makes everyone cross-eyed and so he has to give up all of his money. Steve Martin is fantastic in this movie as the jerk. He's a jerk. He's a guy who does not get it, whose self-entitlement and stupidity get in the way of him ever having a real life, really until the end. It's almost oddly a bit of a takeoff on a Citizen Kane style movie wherein Navin is happy in his relative poverty, finds unhappiness and dysfunction in his wealth, only at the end of the movie to yearn for those simpler times. This is, of course, a really classic and amazing comedy. We watch Navin's life through the whole thing, from when he leaves home to when he gets a job at a gas station with the terrific "he hates these cans" scene that I don't want to go too much into. He works at a carnival, which is fantastic. Meets and falls in love with his girlfriend, who is played by the always fantastic Bernadette Peters, and obviously an amazing singer. I think an underrated comedic talent, and another actress who, while I know she's had a tremendous Broadway career, I wish we had gotten in more movies. A classy and, you know, hilarious lady that I would love to see more of. This is, you know, an all-time great comedy movie that hasn't aged tremendously well in parts. It is a movie that I would love to give 5 stars to, because the peaks of this movie are so very high. There's some, you know, the aforementioned can sequence, the end sequence of "all I need is this paddle ball, and this remote control, and this chair, and this thermos." That's a fantastic. The cat juggling sequence is great, but there's you know, there's maybe half as many jokes that don't really land, and from a narrative standpoint, it's sort of a mess. It is a movie, though, that I dearly love, and that I absolutely think you should see. I just think a little more judicious editing would have made it, you know, age a little bit better. 3.5 stars for The Jerk. One of the movies I must have seen at least 1,000,000 times with my little brother as we were growing up was The Sandlot. This is the movie set in the, 1950s, about a kid who's new in town and makes friends with a bunch of misfit kids playing baseball in a sand lot. Of course, they eventually lose an autographed Babe Ruth the baseball behind a fence to a monstrous dog known as the Beast, and a good portion of the movie is trying to get the baseball back. This is a very episodic sort of a movie as we watch these kids' summer and the various misadventures they get through. There is not so much a unifying plot as a series of incidents that teach our main character, I don't know, to be a man or a boy or something that makes stepdad Dennis Leary finally happy to call him his stepson. It's okay. It's an okay movie. It is a movie that, as a young man, seemed like one of the greats, that looking back on it now is just sort of, you know, it's fine. It's all right. It's a decent enough 90s movie. If you are, for some reason, watching this semi-pretentious and dumb movie review show, and you're, you know, 12 years old and you're looking for a movie to watch, by all means, watch The Sandlot. For the rest of you, if you have fond memories of this from your childhood and you haven't revisited it recently, I would recommend don't. It's not that it's bad, it's just that it's not as good as you would remember. Let's call it 3 stars. One of the great failures and bombs of this past summer was The House, which is a movie starring a bunch of comedic juggernauts who set up a casino in their own home. Look at this cast. You've got Will Ferrell, and Will Ferrell is always tremendous. You've got Amy Poehler, a finer comedic actress you could not ask for in this day and age. You have the great and underrated Jason Mantzoukas in his most prominent movie role. You've maybe seen him in the background of a number of movies. If you were a fan of podcasts, which why wouldn't you be, then you know Jason Mantzoukas from his own podcast, How Did This Get Made, the Great Bad Movie podcast, to his frequent appearances on the all-time classic podcast, Comedy Bang Bang. So great showcase for him in this. You also have a bunch of other comedians from that sort of group of comedians filling out the background, guys like the always tremendous Nick Kroll, whose show Big Mouth on Netflix, if you haven't checked it out, you need to. Or Lennon Parham, who has her own show, up until recently, had her own show on the USA Network called Playing House that you need to watch. Comedy, a real murderer's row of early 2000s alternative comedians in this. The movie itself is nowhere near as bad as its reputation would lead you to believe, or its lack of box office. It's a pretty fun and funny movie that nevertheless is not the best work of any of the people in it. It is certainly not the best Will Ferrell movie or the best Amy Poehler movie, or probably even the best Jason Mantzoukas movie, but it is a fun and funny movie that is worth your time. We're going to call it 3 stars. The movie Nightcrawler is sadly not about the X-Man Kurt Wagner, one of my personal favorite X-Men. No, this is a movie about Jake Gyllenhaal, who is a huge, opportunistic, money-grabbing sleazebag who lives in Los Angeles, who figures out he can hustle some money by filming car accidents and fires and terrible things that happen at night and selling them to news departments. It is a fine performance from Gyllenhaal, and it is a fine performance from everybody else in the movie. It's probably Gyllenhaal's, A+ showcase, top of the line career performance. It's a movie that a lot of people really loved, and I see it. I get why people really love this movie. For me, Gyllenhaal, who is the main character, is so sleazy and unlikable that it, for me, makes the movie not as much fun to watch. He is such a creep, particularly in his dealings with the female news producer that he reports to, that it's a tough one for me to watch. It's a good movie. It is a good movie. It is just not to my taste. So I'm going to toe the line. I'm going to go right down the middle and give this one 3 stars. That is it for this episode of Every Movie Ever. Make sure you join us next time, where we're going to keep trying to review every movie ever made. Good night.